If you ever see a crystal chandelier hanging between grapevines, somebody has already made a terrible decision. The first thing I noticed that morning was the sound. Not tractors, not irrigation pumps, not the familiar rustle of leaves moving through the vineyard. It was the sharp metallic clatter of event crews unloading equipment. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when I looked out across the eastern rows of vines and nearly spilled it. A white cargo truck was parked directly beside Block 7, one of the oldest sections of the vineyard. Workers were carrying folding chairs between rows that should have been completely empty. Another crew was unloading floral arrangements. A third group was setting up long banquet tables covered with white linens. And right in the center of my vineyard, hanging from a temporary frame someone had erected overnight, was a crystal chandelier. My name is Grant Walker, and I have spent most of my life running the same family vineyard my grandfather planted nearly 60 years ago. Every acre of that land mattered. Every row had a purpose. Every season followed a schedule, which was why standing there and watching strangers transform my vineyard into what looked like a luxury wedding venue felt completely surreal. The morning air carried the scent of damp soil, fresh grapes, and cut grass. Sunlight rolled across the hills beyond the property while workers hurried through preparations as though they belonged there. The most shocking part was how comfortable everyone looked. Nobody seemed worried. Nobody appeared nervous about being on private property. They acted like they had permission. By the time I reached the lower access road, several delivery vans had arrived. Decorative arches were being assembled near the western rows. Catering staff wheeled coolers toward a temporary service area. Someone was testing speakers. Soft music drifted through the vineyard while workers adjusted table settings beneath strings of decorative lights. I stopped one of the crew members and asked what was happening. He looked confused. "The charity gala," he said. "We are setting up for tonight." Charity gala. I repeated those words in my head while looking around at hundreds of feet of carefully maintained vineyard being converted into an event space. Then I asked the obvious question. "Who told you this property was available?" The worker pointed toward a black SUV parked near the entrance. The moment I saw it, I already knew the answer. Patricia Monroe stepped out wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a clipboard. Even from 50 yards away, she looked pleased with herself. Patricia was the HOA president of the neighboring community and the kind of person who never confused confidence with correctness because she assumed they were the same thing. She walked toward me smiling as if we were old friends. "Grant," she said, "beautiful day for a fundraiser." I stared at her for several seconds. "You are holding a fundraiser in my vineyard." She laughed lightly. "The community loves this location." Not the answer I asked for. Around us, workers continued preparing for an event that apparently involved donors, local officials, business leaders, and hundreds of guests. I watched another truck arrive carrying decorative landscaping. Then I noticed something that made me almost smile. Near the southern fence line stood a group of goats quietly grazing inside their holding area. Most people would have ignored them. I did not. Because while Patricia was busy planning the most elegant evening of her career, those goats were about to become the most important part of mine. Patricia acted as though the conversation was already over. She checked something on her clipboard, nodded toward the crews, and walked away before I could say another word. Around us, the vineyard continued transforming into a luxury event venue. White tablecloths stretched between rows of grapevines. Florists carried arrangements of roses and hydrangeas across ground that should have been reserved for equipment access. Catering staff unloaded trays and supplies while electricians tested decorative lighting suspended above my vines. The entire scene felt unreal. Yet what bothered me most was not the event itself. It was the assumption behind it. Patricia genuinely believed she had the right to use someone else's property because she thought the cause was important enough. I spent the rest of the morning gathering information. The first thing I confirmed was that nobody from the vineyard had signed a rental agreement. No contract existed. No permission had been granted. No insurance documentation had been submitted through our office. The second thing I confirmed was even more interesting. The gala had been advertised for weeks. Social media posts showed renderings of elegant dining tables among the vines. Local businesses had donated auction items. Several elected officials planned to attend. Hundreds of tickets had already been sold. Patricia had built an entire event around a location she never legally secured. By early afternoon, the California sun had warmed the vineyard. The smell of ripe grapes drifted through the air while workers hurried to finish preparations before evening. I drove a utility vehicle toward the southern pasture where our goats were kept. The moment I arrived, hundreds of curious faces turned toward me. Some were grazing. Others were climbing rocks or investigating feed stations. To most visitors, they looked like ordinary farm animals. To me, they were employees. Every one of them served a purpose. For years, we had used goats as part of our vegetation management program. They controlled weeds, reduced fire hazards, and helped maintain sections of the property that machinery could not easily reach. It was efficient, environmentally friendly, and perfectly normal for a working vineyard. The largest rotation of the season happened to be scheduled for that very evening. I checked the operation calendar hanging inside the equipment shed. There it was. The date had been marked months earlier. Southern Holding Area Transfer. 500 goats. Estimated release time, 1 hour before sunset. I stood there staring at the schedule while a slow smile appeared on my face. The date was not new. The plan was not improvised. Nothing needed to be changed. The goats were going exactly where they were supposed to go according to a schedule that existed long before Patricia planned her fundraiser. As afternoon turned toward evening, luxury vehicles began arriving. Volunteers parked cars near the entrance. Guests stepped out wearing formal attire completely unsuited for a working agricultural property. The contrast was almost comical. Expensive shoes moved across dusty vineyard roads. Elegant dresses brushed against grape leaves. Waiters carried trays while speakers played soft music across the hills. Standing near the tasting barn, I watched the growing crowd gather beneath decorative lights. Patricia moved through the event greeting donors and posing for photographs like a celebrity. She looked triumphant. She looked completely in control. And just beyond the southern fence line, 500 goats waited patiently for their regularly scheduled evening assignment. By 6 o'clock, the vineyard looked less like a farm and more like a magazine cover. Long rows of tables stretched between the vines beneath strings of glowing lights. Crystal glasses reflected the warm colors of the setting sun. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers while servers moved gracefully among guests carrying trays of appetizers. The scent of grapes mixed with expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and catered food. If someone had arrived without knowing the property, they might have believed the event belonged there. That illusion was exactly what Patricia wanted. She moved through the crowd greeting donors, local business owners, and community leaders with the confidence of someone enjoying her greatest success. Everywhere she walked, people complimented the venue. Several guests stopped to admire the view across the rolling hills. Others took photographs beside the vines. More than once I heard someone describe the vineyard as the perfect setting for a gala. What made those comments amusing was the fact that nobody seemed interested in asking the owner. I spent most of the evening near the equipment barn on the edge of the property. From there I could see almost everything. The auction area, the dining section, the temporary stage where Patricia planned to deliver a speech before sunset. Every detail had been carefully designed. Elegant centerpieces decorated the tables. Large floral displays framed the entrance. Decorative shrubs had even been brought in specifically for the event. Those shrubs would become important later. As the sky slowly turned orange, I checked my watch. 45 minutes remained before the scheduled transfer. Not the gala schedule, the farm schedule. The one that existed long before invitations were printed. The one nobody at the event bothered to ask about. A ranch supervisor named Tyler drove up in a utility vehicle carrying several clipboards. He looked toward the crowd and shook his head. "That is a lot of people," he said. I nodded. "Looks that way." He glanced toward the southern pasture. "You still want us following the rotation plan?" That question was important, because at that moment I had every opportunity to change the schedule. I could postpone the transfer, delay it until the following day, move the animals somewhere else. But doing so would mean altering normal operations because somebody decided to host a luxury event on a working vineyard without permission. I looked across the property. Patricia stood near the stage laughing with guests while photographers captured images of the evening. Everything about her body language suggested victory. "Follow the schedule," I said. Tyler nodded and drove away. The decision was made, not because I was creating a problem, because I was refusing to solve one that somebody else created. A few minutes later, Patricia stepped onto the stage. The crowd applauded. Golden sunlight stretched across the vineyard as she began speaking about community service, generosity, and bringing people together. Guests smiled and raised glasses. Cameras flashed. The atmosphere felt polished and carefully controlled. Then, from somewhere beyond the southern rows, a sound drifted across the property. At first it was faint, barely noticeable beneath the music and conversation. A low chorus of bleating carried by the evening breeze. Most guests ignored it. Patricia certainly did. But I recognized the sound immediately. So did every employee who worked on the vineyard. We exchanged quiet glances while the sun edged closer to the horizon. Because right on schedule, 500 extremely motivated farm workers had just begun moving toward their next assignment. The first guests noticed them before they actually saw them. The sound arrived first. A growing wave of bleating carried across the vineyard on the evening breeze. It floated through the music, around the dining tables, and between rows of grapevines glowing beneath strings of decorative lights. At first, people simply looked around with mild curiosity. A few laughed. Others assumed the noise came from a nearby farm because, technically, it did. Patricia continued her speech without hesitation. She stood beneath soft stage lighting talking about community engagement and charitable giving while guests applauded politely. Then movement appeared near the southern edge of the property. Hundreds of small shapes emerged between the rows. The golden light of sunset reflected off white, brown, and black coats as the herd advanced in a slow, organized wave. 500 goats might not sound impressive on paper. In reality, it is an astonishing amount of goat. The animals moved with purpose because they had followed this route many times before. Ranch employees guided them calmly through designated grazing areas exactly as scheduled. Nothing about the operation was unusual from the vineyard's perspective. The unusual part was the luxury Gala occupying the same space. Conversations began stopping one table at a time. Guests turned in their seats. Some stood. Others pulled out phones. The closer the herd moved, the more attention it attracted. Patricia finally noticed the distraction spreading through the audience. She paused mid-sentence and looked toward the southern rows. For several seconds, she simply stared. I watched the expression on her face change from confusion to disbelief. The goats continued forward. Some wandered toward decorative landscaping that had been brought in specifically for the event. Others investigated floral displays positioned beside the dining area. A few discovered potted plants arranged near the stage. Guests stepped aside while laughing nervously. The atmosphere shifted from formal elegance to complete unpredictability. One donor wearing an expensive suit climbed onto a low stone wall to avoid becoming surrounded by curious animals. Nearby, a group of guests abandoned a photo opportunity because several goats seemed far more interested in the flower arrangements than the camera. The scene looked less like a charity gala and more like a nature documentary colliding with a luxury event. What made it remarkable was how calm the goats remained. They were not causing chaos intentionally. They were simply doing what goats do. Exploring, grazing, investigating anything remotely edible. The decorative shrubs proved especially popular. I stood near the equipment barn watching the entire spectacle unfold. Tyler drove up beside me in a utility vehicle and quietly asked, "Everything running according to schedule?" I looked across the vineyard. Guests were taking pictures. Servers were trying to navigate around wandering animals. Patricia was hurrying off the stage toward the grazing area with an expression that suggested she had just realized something important. "Exactly according to schedule," I replied. The sunset painted the hills orange and gold while the herd continued its evening migration. From a distance, the scene almost looked beautiful. Rows of grapevines, warm evening light, elegant decorations, hundreds of goats moving through the landscape. The only person not appreciating the view was Patricia. Because for the first time all evening, she seemed to understand that the vineyard was not an event venue pretending to be a farm. It was a farm pretending to be an event venue. And farms always win that argument. Patricia reached me less than 3 minutes after leaving the stage. She moved quickly across the vineyard, carefully avoiding clusters of goats that were now scattered throughout the event area. Her expression had changed completely from the confident smile she wore earlier. The sunset glow still illuminated the property, but the atmosphere of the gala had transformed. Guests were no longer focused on speeches, fundraising goals, or auction items. Every conversation revolved around the animals. Phones were everywhere. People were taking photographs, recording videos, and laughing as curious goats inspected decorations that had seemed so important only an hour earlier. "Grant," Patricia said sharply, "you need to remove them." I looked around. "Remove who?" Her jaw tightened. "The goats." I followed her gaze toward the nearest group. Several were calmly grazing beside a decorative flower display. Another stood near a row of vines watching guests with what appeared to be mild curiosity. None of them seemed aware they were ruining the most carefully planned evening of Patricia's year. "They are supposed to be here," I replied. "This is their scheduled grazing rotation." Patricia stared at me as though I had spoken another language. "You cannot be serious." I reached into the utility vehicle and pulled out a clipboard containing the vineyard operations schedule. The pages were dated months earlier. Inspection notes, grazing assignments, rotation maps, employee signatures. Every detail had been documented long before the fundraiser existed. Patricia flipped through several pages while the sounds of bleating drifted across the vineyard behind her. The more she read, the more frustrated she became. Because there was nothing unexpected about the schedule. Nothing had been changed. Nothing had been arranged in response to the event. The goats were exactly where they were supposed to be according to normal agricultural operations. "Why did nobody tell me?" she demanded. That question almost made me laugh. Nobody asked. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, the evening continued unfolding in increasingly entertaining ways. Guests who originally appeared annoyed had started treating the entire situation as part of the experience. Several donors posed for photographs with goats. Others recorded videos while laughing. A local business owner was attempting to take a selfie beside a particularly friendly animal that seemed fascinated by his tie. The fundraiser was no longer elegant, but it was certainly memorable. Patricia looked horrified by that reality. She had envisioned polished social media coverage showcasing community leadership and charitable success. Instead, dozens of people were uploading videos featuring goats wandering through a luxury gala. The internet was about to enjoy this farm more than any fundraising speech. As twilight deepened across the vineyard, decorative lights began glowing above the tables. The contrast between sophistication and farm reality became even more dramatic. Crystal glassware sparkled beneath string lights while goats wandered peacefully through the landscape performing their assigned task. The scene felt almost surreal. Yet from an agricultural perspective, everything was perfectly normal. One guest approached me carrying a wine glass and smiling broadly. "This is the best fundraiser I have ever attended," he said. "Do the goats come every year?" I nearly choked trying not to laugh. Across the property, Patricia overheard the comment. Her expression suggested she was reconsidering every decision that led to this moment. Meanwhile, the herd continued moving through the vineyard exactly according to plan. Sunset approached. The sky turned deep shades of orange and purple, and with every passing minute, the realization became harder for Patricia to escape. She had not rented a venue. She had accidentally hosted a gala in the middle of an active working farm. The strangest part of the evening was how quickly the guests adapted. By the time darkness settled over the vineyard, the fundraiser had split into two completely different events. Patricia was still trying to preserve the elegant atmosphere she had spent months planning, while everyone else seemed fascinated by the unexpected farm experience unfolding around them. String lights glowed above the rows of vines. The air smelled of grapes, earth, and freshly cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, a live musician continued playing soft acoustic music as though nothing unusual had happened. Meanwhile, 500 goats continued moving through their designated grazing route with remarkable efficiency. I walked along the edge of the property, watching the transformation take place. The animals had become the center of attention. Guests who arrived expecting formal speeches were now taking photographs beside grazing goats. Business owners were laughing. Families were recording videos. Even several local officials seemed entertained by the situation. One woman in an evening dress spent nearly 10 minutes trying to take the perfect picture with a goat that appeared more interested in a decorative shrub than the camera. Every few minutes, I heard another burst of laughter from somewhere among the tables. Patricia, however, looked increasingly frustrated. She moved from group to group, attempting to redirect attention back toward the fundraiser. The problem was simple. Nobody wanted to discuss fundraising goals anymore. They wanted to talk about the goats. The internet was not helping. Guests were posting videos almost immediately. I overheard people reading comments aloud from friends who were watching online. One video showed a line of goats walking calmly beneath decorative lights while guests applauded. Another showed a curious goat standing beside a luxury centerpiece worth more than most farm equipment. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Around 8 o'clock, a volunteer approached Patricia carrying a phone. I could not hear the conversation, but I could see her expression. Whatever appeared on the screen clearly did not improve her mood. Later, Tyler showed me the reason. A short video from the gala had already begun spreading across local social media pages. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments. Most people found the situation hilarious. More importantly, many viewers were asking the same question. Why was a charity gala being held on private agricultural land without the owner's permission? Suddenly, the story was no longer about goats. It was about entitlement. The more attention the event received, the more people started examining how it happened in the first place. As the evening continued, the fundraiser never completely collapsed. Donations were still collected. Auction items were still sold. But Patricia lost control of the narrative. Instead of being remembered as the organizer of an elegant community event, she was becoming associated with the most unusual vineyard fundraiser anyone in the county could remember. Near the southern rows, I watched the last sections of the herd complete their rotation. Ranch employees guided them calmly through the property exactly as planned. The operation remained professional from start to finish. No emergencies, no surprises. Just normal farm work occurring on schedule. Standing there beneath the lights, listening to distant laughter and the occasional sound of bleating drifting across the vineyard, I realized something important. Patricia thought she was hosting an event on a venue. She never understood she was borrowing space inside a living, working operation with its own schedule, priorities, and rules. And for the first time all evening, the entire community was beginning to understand that difference too. The following morning, the vineyard was quieter than it had been in days. A light layer of fog drifted between the rows while the first rays of sunlight crept across the hills. The scent of damp earth and ripe grapes filled the air. Most of the decorations were gone. Event crews had spent hours dismantling tables, loading equipment, and removing anything that reminded people of the previous evening. Yet one thing remained: the story. By 7 o'clock, my phone had already received dozens of messages. Friends from neighboring counties had seen the videos. Former customers were sending screenshots. Local agricultural groups were sharing clips across social media. The footage seemed to be everywhere. Guests laughing beside goats. Elegant banquet tables surrounded by curious animals. Patricia standing near the stage looking completely stunned while the herd calmly continued its scheduled rotation. The internet had chosen its favorite version of events, and it was not the one Patricia had planned. Around mid-morning, I drove into town for supplies. The moment I stepped inside the feed store, I knew the videos had spread further than I realized. 2 ranchers near the counter immediately started laughing. One pointed at me and said, "You are the vineyard guy." Another shook his head and grinned. "Best fundraiser I have ever seen." Throughout the day, similar conversations happened everywhere. At the hardware store, at the gas station, at the coffee shop. Nobody seemed angry. Nobody seemed outraged. Most people were simply amazed that someone had attempted to host a luxury gala in the middle of an active agricultural operation without coordinating with the owner. The more the story spread, the more questions people asked about how the event had been approved in the first place. That was where things became uncomfortable for Patricia. Videos featuring goats were entertaining. Discussions about property rights were much more serious. Several local reporters began contacting attendees. Community message boards filled with debates. Residents wanted to know why private agricultural land had been treated as a public event venue. They wanted to know whether permission had ever been granted. Most importantly, they wanted answers from the HOA leadership. By late afternoon, Patricia released a statement attempting to explain the situation. Unfortunately for her, the statement only created more questions. Every explanation eventually ran into the same problem. There was no signed agreement, no rental contract, no documented authorization. The facts were remarkably simple. Meanwhile, life at the vineyard returned to normal. Employees worked among the vines. Equipment moved through the fields. The goats continued their routine exactly as they had before the gala. Standing near the southern pasture that evening, I watched several of them grazing peacefully beneath the golden light of sunset. They looked completely unaware that they had become local celebrities overnight. In a strange way, That made the entire situation even funnier. The animals had not disrupted anything intentionally. They simply followed the schedule. The real disruption came from someone assuming a working farm would stop being a working farm because a fundraiser happened to be scheduled there. As the sun disappeared beyond the hills, I looked across the vineyard and reflected on everything that had happened. Patricia believed authority could replace permission. She believed confidence could replace planning. Now the community was beginning to understand the difference. And the more people talked about the fundraiser, the less they discussed the goats, and the more they discussed the decision that put everyone in that situation to begin with. 3 days after the fundraiser, the HOA held an emergency community meeting. Normally, those meetings attracted a modest crowd. This one filled every available seat. People lined the walls. Others stood near the entrances. The atmosphere felt different from previous gatherings. Residents were not there to discuss landscaping guidelines or mailbox colors. They wanted answers. Outside, the evening air was cool and carried the scent of recently cut grass from the surrounding neighborhood. Inside, the room buzzed with conversation before the meeting even began. I arrived early and sat quietly near the back. Patricia entered several minutes later carrying a thick folder of documents. She looked tired, not defeated, just exhausted. The previous week had transformed a local fundraiser into a county-wide conversation. Every attempt to explain the situation seemed to generate new questions. As the meeting started, several board members reviewed routine business items. Nobody paid much attention. Everyone knew why the room was full. Eventually, the discussion turned toward the fundraiser. The first questions came from homeowners, then local business owners, then residents who had attended the event themselves. Most were polite. Some were frustrated. But nearly all of them focused on the same issue. Why had private agricultural property been used without formal permission from the owner? Patricia attempted to explain her reasoning. She spoke about community benefit. She discussed fundraising goals. She described conversations she believed suggested cooperation. The problem was that intentions are not the same thing as authorization. Every explanation eventually reached that wall. A homeowner sitting near the front asked whether a signed agreement existed. Another asked whether insurance approvals had been coordinated with the property owner. A third questioned why agricultural operations had never been reviewed before selecting the location. Each question made the situation more difficult to defend. Meanwhile, several attendees quietly shared videos from the fundraiser. Every few minutes, another phone screen displayed footage of goats moving through the vineyard beneath decorative lights. The room occasionally erupted into laughter despite everyone's efforts to remain serious. The images had become impossible to separate from the discussion. Around halfway through the meeting, one longtime resident stood and said something that changed the tone completely. "The goats are not the issue," he said. "The issue is assuming somebody else's property belongs to the community just because you want to use it." The room became noticeably quieter. For the first time, nobody was talking about the spectacle. They were talking about the principle behind it. Property rights, respect, communication, accountability. Those topics mattered far more than a herd of goats. As the meeting continued, several board members began distancing themselves from the decision-making process that led to the fundraiser. Questions turned into reviews. Reviews turned into policy discussions. By the end of the evening, proposals were already being discussed to strengthen approval procedures for future events. Standing outside afterward beneath the glow of parking lot lights, I watched residents leave in small groups. Most conversations sounded remarkably reasonable. People were not angry at the vineyard. They were not angry at the goats. They were disappointed by assumptions that should never have been made. Across the parking lot, Patricia stood speaking quietly with several board members. Her confident certainty had finally been replaced by something much more useful. Perspective. The fundraiser had raised money. The goats had become famous. But the biggest outcome was something nobody expected. The community had started asking better questions. And once people begin asking better questions, it becomes very difficult for old habits to survive. A month later, the vineyard looked exactly the way it always had. The rows of grapevines stretched across the hills in perfect lines. The morning sun painted the landscape gold. Irrigation systems clicked quietly in the distance. The scent of earth, leaves, and ripening fruit drifted through the cool air. If someone visited for the first time, they would never know a charity gala had once taken over the property. Yet traces of that evening remained everywhere, not on the land, but in the community. The HOA adopted new approval policies requiring written authorization for any event involving private property. Insurance reviews became mandatory. Documentation standards were strengthened. Procedures that should have existed all along finally appeared because people had learned an important lesson. Assumptions are not agreements. Meanwhile, Patricia's influence gradually faded. She remained part of the community, but the unquestioned authority she once enjoyed was gone. Residents had become more willing to ask questions, more willing to verify information, more willing to challenge decisions before they became problems. Ironically, the fundraiser achieved something valuable after all. It encouraged accountability. As for the vineyard, business actually improved. Visitors arrived specifically because they had seen videos online. Some wanted to walk through the famous rows where the gala took place. Others wanted photographs with the goats that accidentally became local celebrities. More than once I heard tourists ask employees where they could find the fundraising goats. The animals, of course, had no idea any of this happened. They continued grazing, rotating through pastures, and performing the same work they had always performed. Their lives remained wonderfully uncomplicated. One afternoon near harvest season, I stood beside the southern pasture watching the herd move across the hillside. The same route, the same schedule, the same quiet efficiency. Tyler walked over carrying a clipboard and nodded toward the animals. "Still famous," he said. I laughed. Probably more famous than the vineyard. He was not entirely wrong. The videos continued circulating online long after the event ended. Every few weeks, someone would repost a clip and introduce the story to a new audience. Thousands of people had watched what happened. Most remembered the goats. The smarter observers remembered something else. They remembered why the goats were there in the first place. Looking back, the funniest part was how simple the entire situation really was. There was no master plan, no elaborate revenge scheme, no secret trap. I never changed the grazing schedule. I never altered operations. I never instructed anyone to disrupt the event. I simply refused to stop a working farm from functioning as a working farm. Everything that followed grew naturally from that decision. The crystal chandelier, the luxury tables, the speeches, the decorations. All of it had been temporary. The vineyard endured. The schedule endured. The goats endured. As the sun slowly set over the hills, casting long shadows across the rows of vines, I watched the herd disappear beyond the southern pasture. The evening felt peaceful, familiar, right? Patricia thought she had found the perfect venue for a charity gala. What she actually found was a lesson hidden inside 500 hardworking farm animals. The community eventually learned it too. Respect property. Respect the people who maintain it. And never assume a farm will stop being a farm simply because someone hung a chandelier in the middle of it. Justice did not arrive with lawyers, arguments, or dramatic confrontations. It arrived exactly on schedule, moving across the vineyard one goat at a time.